The life of a truck driver is full of mysteries and surprises. With every mile traveled, you never know what lies ahead or who you might encounter. Trust becomes a rare commodity on the road, especially when deciding whether or not to offer a ride to a stranger. So when Roberto, a seasoned truck driver, spotted a nun hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere, his first instinct was to drive past without a second thought. But something in him, perhaps his conscience, made him slow down and eventually stop. Little did he know that this simple act of kindness would lead to an encounter that would forever change his life. Roberto was no stranger to the road, having spent over 2 decades behind the wheel. He had seen it all: the good, the bad, and the unpredictable. However, the phase he was going through now was unlike anything he had experienced before. The truck he was driving wasn't even his. It was an old, worn-out rental, far from ideal for long hauls. The vehicle's condition made it difficult to secure large shipments, and the little money he earned barely covered his mounting bills and the essentials for his family. Being away from home most of the time only added to his financial strain, as he had to set aside a chunk of his income for emergencies that could arise during his travels. Every day, at precisely 4 a.m., Roberto would drag himself out of bed and brace himself for another grueling day on the highway, which often lasted until nightfall. Some people wondered why he avoided driving at night, but Roberto preferred not to explain. There was a reason he kept hidden, a secret connected to a traumatic experience from his past, something he would rather forget. 2 years earlier, Roberto had been through the worst accident of his life. At the time, he was in the middle of a busy work period, making decent money, when an opportunity arose to transport a large shipment of rice with a friend. The payout was tempting, and both men were eager to finish the route quickly and return to their families. However, trouble began when Roberto's friend suggested loading the truck with more cargo than it could safely carry. Although Roberto noticed the truck felt unusually heavy, he didn't question it, driven by the desire to get home sooner. They decided to take a shortcut through the mountains, skipping rest breaks and meals to save time. Every 5 hours, they took turns driving, trying to stave off the fatigue that inevitably came with such a demanding schedule. But during the night, the exhaustion caught up with them. Roberto vividly recalled how his eyelids felt like lead, and he drifted into brief moments of sleep, even as his hands remained on the wheel. The darkness and silence of the road seemed to pull him into a trance. Despite his efforts to stay awake, his body betrayed him. Suddenly, the blinding lights of an oncoming truck jolted him out of his drowsiness, but by then it was too late. The impact was unavoidable. Everything seemed to spin in those terrifying moments, and Roberto's clearest memory was of his friend being thrown through the windshield. The accident not only destroyed the truck, but also shattered Roberto's life. He was left with severe physical injuries and an even deeper emotional wound: the loss of his friend. After the accident, everything Roberto had worked so hard to build came crumbling down. The once promising career, the sense of security, and most painfully his friendship, all gone. He spent months in physical rehabilitation and therapy, pouring his savings into his recovery. But the emotional scars were the hardest to heal. Since then, Roberto swore he would never drive at night again, and his financial troubles began to pile up. His confidence in himself and his future had been shaken to the core. On that fateful morning, as Roberto sat behind the wheel of his old rental truck, sipping his coffee and watching the first light of dawn break over the horizon, he had no reason to believe that the day would be any different from the countless others he had endured. But as he drove down a familiar stretch of road, he noticed something unusual: a figure in the distance, standing by the roadside. As he approached, he realized it was a nun, dressed in a traditional habit, signaling for a ride. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. This wasn't just any roadside. It was an area infamous among truckers as a spot frequented by women working the night. Seeing a nun there felt out of place, almost like a bad omen. Roberto's initial reaction was to step on the gas and keep going. But as the heat of the day began to intensify and the sight of the stranded nun lingered in his mind, his conscience weighed heavily on him. Unable to shake the feeling, he finally pulled over and asked where she was headed. The nun, calm and composed, explained that she needed to reach a farm about an hour away, in the same direction Roberto was traveling. Clearing the passenger seat of scattered newspapers and his lunchbox, Roberto made room for her. As they resumed the journey, an awkward silence filled the cabin. Eventually, Roberto, still unsettled by the oddness of the situation, broke the silence. "Do you know about the women who work around here at night?" he asked cautiously. To his shock, the nun responded without hesitation. "Yes, I was working with them," she said matter-of-factly. Roberto's mind raced. How could a nun, a symbol of purity and devotion, have been working among those women? He didn't dare ask for details, but his curiosity gnawed at him. The nun, who introduced herself as Guadalupe, soon revealed that it was God who had sent Roberto to her aid. She explained that she had been standing by the road for hours, ignored by countless truckers who were too afraid of being seen stopping in such a notorious place. She was beginning to lose hope, desperate to reunite with her family, who knew nothing of the work she had been doing. As Roberto processed her words, another danger appeared ahead. A group of armed men had set up a roadblock, and there was no way around it. The gang forced Roberto to stop, despite the nun's pleas for mercy. With no cargo to steal, the thieves turned to Roberto's wallet, taking every last cent he had earned from his recent delivery. The encounter was brief, but left Roberto devastated. Everything he had worked for, every sacrifice he had made, seemed to have been for nothing. Trembling with frustration and anger, Roberto muttered under his breath, "It's not fair. I work so hard, and they just take everything." Though Guadalupe offered words of comfort, Roberto knew they wouldn't ease the weight of his financial burdens. How would he face his family, empty-handed once again? Despite his emotional turmoil, Roberto fulfilled his promise and delivered the nun safely to her destination, a sprawling farm surrounded by orchards and crops. To his astonishment, Guadalupe revealed that the farm belonged to her family and that her father was a wealthy landowner. Seeing Roberto's shaken state, she insisted that he wasn't fit to continue his journey and invited him to rest at their home until he felt ready to hit the road again. At first, Roberto hesitated. He wasn't used to accepting help, especially from strangers. But when the police arrived at the farm to investigate the robbery, he realized it would be safer to stay for a few days. What he didn't expect was the overwhelming hospitality that awaited him. The nun's family treated him like one of their own, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Roberto experienced a sense of peace. As Roberto struggled to keep his eyes open, exhaustion began to take its toll. His vision blurred, and he found himself nodding off, despite every effort to stay awake. Suddenly, the blinding lights of an oncoming truck pierced through the darkness, jolting him awake with a surge of adrenaline. But by then, it was too late. The collision was inevitable. In the split second before impact, the world seemed to spin uncontrollably around him. Metal twisted, glass shattered, and in a horrifying flash, Roberto's clearest memory was of his friend being violently thrown through the windshield. It was a devastating loss. After the accident, Roberto watched helplessly as everything he had worked for crumbled before his eyes. But the wreckage of the truck was insignificant compared to the grief that consumed him. The death of his friend haunted him, a torment he couldn't shake. The truck had been destroyed beyond repair, but the emotional scars Roberto carried were far deeper. The road to recovery was long and grueling, filled with therapy sessions and endless attempts at physical rehabilitation. His body had been broken, but it was his spirit that bore the heaviest wounds. Rebuilding his life from scratch, Roberto spent all his savings trying to piece his world back together. The emotional trauma of the accident left him grappling with nightmares and overwhelming guilt. Driving at night, a time when the accident had occurred, became a boundary he swore never to cross again. The darkness of the road held too many painful memories, too many shadows of his past. Yet, one morning, something truly unexpected happened. Something that would become one of the strangest and most unforgettable episodes of Roberto's life. Like any other day, Roberto woke at 4 a.m., following his usual routine. After his morning coffee, he sat in the cab of his truck, patiently waiting for the sky to lighten. As the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon, he prepared to hit the road, the day ahead promising to be uneventful. It seemed like another routine morning, but fate had other plans. After completing his delivery and on his way back, Roberto's truck now empty, his wallet pleasantly full from the job well done, he drove through a stretch of road well known among truckers. The road was infamous for reasons that made him uneasy. Then, something caught his eye, a figure standing by the roadside. As he got closer, his heart skipped a beat. A nun, dressed in a traditional habit, was signaling for a ride. For most people, seeing a nun might not have been particularly strange, but Roberto knew the area. It was notorious for being a spot frequented by women working the night, a fact well known to travelers. The sight of a nun in such a place sent a chill down his spine, as if the universe was playing a cruel trick on him. His first instinct was to speed up and keep driving, to avoid getting involved in whatever strange circumstances had led her there. But then he heard a weather report on the radio, warning of extreme heat in the region. He couldn't, in good conscience, leave her standing there. Nervously, Roberto pulled over and asked the nun where she needed to go. She explained, in a calm and composed voice, that she needed to be dropped off at a farm about an hour away, which happened to be in the same direction he was heading. Clearing the passenger seat of scattered newspapers and his lunchbox, Roberto made room for her. As the truck started moving again, an awkward silence filled the air, one that felt heavier with every passing mile. Unable to ignore the unsettling questions swirling in his mind, Roberto broke the silence. "Do you know about the women who work along this stretch of the road?" he asked, his voice cautious. "The ones who work nights?" Her response left him utterly speechless. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I was working with them." Roberto's mind raced. How could a nun, a symbol of purity, faith, and devotion, admit to such a thing? His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. He wanted to ask more, to understand how someone like her could end up in such a place. But he found himself too unsettled to continue the conversation. Instead, he quietly observed her. She was young, and despite the harshness of the situation, there was an ethereal beauty about her. The longer they drove, the more questions burned inside his head. The nun, sensing his discomfort, introduced herself as Guadalupe. She explained that God had sent Roberto to help her. She recounted how many truckers had passed by her that morning, none of them willing to stop, afraid of being seen in such a disreputable area. She needed desperately to return to her family, who had no idea about her nighttime work. Guadalupe expressed her growing fears about the escalating violence in the places she had been, saying that danger seemed to follow her wherever she went. She feared for her life. As Roberto listened, his sense of indignation grew. How could a nun admit to being involved in such a sinful place? Before he could fully process his thoughts, something even more alarming happened. His attention was drawn to the road ahead. Men with guns were standing in his path. It was an ambush. Roberto had no choice but to stop. The gang of armed assailants forced him to pull over, even though his truck was empty. Despite Guadalupe's pleas for mercy, the masked men took all the money Roberto had earned from his delivery. The encounter was terrifying and brief, but it left Roberto devastated. Every hard-earned penny gone in an instant. As Roberto trembled with frustration and anger, he started the truck again, muttering under his breath, "This isn't fair. I work so hard, and they take everything." Guadalupe tried to offer words of comfort, her soft voice soothing, but Roberto knew her words wouldn't pay his bills or put food on his family's table. The despair weighed heavily on him, but he was determined to fulfill his promise and take Guadalupe to her destination. When they finally arrived at the farm, Roberto was astonished to learn that it belonged to Guadalupe's family. The sprawling property was vast, with lush orchards and fields stretching as far as the eye could see. Despite his emotional turmoil, Roberto ensured that Guadalupe was safely delivered. But what she revealed next took him by surprise. The nun's father was a wealthy landowner, and seeing Roberto's distraught state, Guadalupe insisted that he stay at the farm for a few days to recover from the ordeal. At first, Roberto was reluctant, not used to accepting help from strangers. But when the police arrived to investigate the robbery, he realized it would be safer to stay. What he didn't expect was the overwhelming hospitality he received at the nuns' family home. He was treated not as a guest, but as one of their own. For the first time in a long while, Roberto felt a sense of peace, an experience that would linger in his memory for years to come. The masked men forced Roberto to stop in the middle of the road, despite his truck being empty. The nuns' pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears as the assailants rifled through his belongings, taking every last bit of cash from his wallet. It was a tense, harrowing moment, and as the thieves sped off, Roberto felt the weight of despair settle heavily on his shoulders. Every mile he had driven, every hour he had worked, now seemed pointless. He would return home empty-handed, unable to provide even the basics for his family. Financial obligations were relentless, bills were due, loans were pending, and there was no reprieve in sight. Trembling, he restarted the truck, muttering under his breath, "This isn't fair. I worked so hard for these bandits to just take everything." The nun, sitting quietly beside him, offered gentle words of comfort. But Roberto knew those words, no matter how kind, wouldn't fill his children's stomachs or keep the lights on at home. He was emotionally wrecked, yet he resolved to push forward, fulfilling his promise to get the nun to her destination. As they approached the sprawling farm, a vast estate with orchards, crops, and animals everywhere, Roberto marveled at the contrast between his own life and this world of apparent abundance. Despite his anguish, he made sure to fulfill his commitment, dropping Guadalupe off as promised. But what came next surprised him. The nun revealed that the farm belonged to her family, and her father was a wealthy landowner. Seeing Roberto's emotional state, Guadalupe insisted he was in no condition to continue driving. She suggested he rest at the farm, at least until the trauma of the robbery had somewhat subsided. At first, Roberto hesitated. He was not accustomed to accepting help, especially from strangers. However, when the police arrived to investigate the ambush, he finally agreed to stay a few days for safety. The accommodations at the farm were far beyond what Roberto could have expected. It felt like staying at a five-star hotel. The meals were delicious, and the nights were restful, something Roberto hadn't experienced in a long time. Each day, he called his wife, sharing the struggles they faced, particularly the need to secure new loans to rent another truck. He also mentioned the nun's peculiar behavior, as she seemed to sneak out late at night, hitchhiking towards the area where the brothel was located. Despite his growing concerns, Roberto chose not to intervene. He was deeply grateful for the family's generosity, but the nun's actions were a mystery he preferred not to involve himself in. Late one night, a soft, unexpected knock on Roberto's door broke the silence. Surprised, he opened it to find Guadalupe standing there, her face calm but resolute. She gestured for him to follow her, and with quiet steps, she led him down the dimly lit hallway to a secluded room used for storing provisions. As they walked, Roberto couldn't contain his thoughts any longer. "It doesn't seem right for a nun to be doing what you're doing," he blurted out. Guadalupe, unfazed by his remark, responded calmly. "I'm on a break from my official duties at the church, but I've sworn to dedicate my life to serving others. This is just part of that promise." When they finally reached the room, the nun opened the door, revealing a scene that took Roberto completely by surprise. Inside, a young woman sat, cradling a baby in her arms. Guadalupe spoke softly. "This is Christina. While working at the place where you picked me up, I came to know her story. I visited every day to offer support, and on the day you stopped, I just helped her deliver this baby." The sight before him illuminated a reality far different from what Roberto had imagined. The image of the nun, sneaking off to a brothel at night, had clouded his judgment. Now, he stood face to face with her compassion and dedication. He had misunderstood everything. A wave of shame washed over him as he realized how quick he had been to judge. "I want to thank you for keeping this to yourself until I could convince my father to help," Guadalupe added, explaining that Christina and her baby would stay at the farm until the church could arrange housing and financial aid to help them rebuild their lives. Roberto was deeply moved by the nun's selflessness. Her quiet resolve and devotion to helping others had left him speechless. The weight of his own hastiness and misjudgments bore down on him, and he silently vowed to be more cautious with his assumptions in the future. The compassion he had witnessed resonated deeply in his heart, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something akin to peace. The next morning, as Roberto prepared to leave the farm, something curious happened. He started his truck, but it felt unusually heavy. Concerned, he decided to check the cargo bay, wondering if there had been a mechanical issue. When he opened the back, what he found overwhelmed him. The truck was filled with sacks of grains, fruits, vegetables, and even salted meats. Enough provisions to last his family for weeks. Tears welled up in Roberto's eyes and began streaming down his face uncontrollably. This unexpected act of kindness left him utterly speechless. He had been through so much, and yet, in this moment, all his burdens seemed to lift, if only for a little while. "What's going on?" Roberto asked, his voice filled with both confusion and amazement as he took in the scene before him. The truck, now loaded with provisions, was far more than he had expected. "I think my children will have more than enough to eat for a long time," he continued, his tone brimming with excitement. Embracing the nun and her entire family, Roberto felt an immense surge of gratitude filling his chest. His heart overflowed with emotion, and as he reached out to shake the hand of the young woman's father, he was handed something unexpected, a deposit receipt and an address. "Not everything in the truck is yours," the nun's father said with a solemn voice, his eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, perhaps even mystery. "You must deliver part of this cargo to a specific address in your city. A friend of mine, a prominent trader, is expecting it," he continued, revealing more details about the unexpected load now resting in Roberto's truck. Roberto, feeling a wave of relief wash over him, also sensed a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of the responsibility he carried felt lighter now, buoyed by a sense of divine providence that seemed to guide his every step. As he navigated the familiar roads back home, his mind raced with thoughts of how this delivery could impact not only his own life, but also the lives of others. There was a deeper meaning to his journey, one that had slowly unfolded over the course of his adventure. When Roberto finally arrived in his hometown, he was met with joyous celebrations. His family and neighbors gathered, their faces glowing with happiness and relief at his safe return. They rejoiced not only for his survival, but for the success of his journey. But as the festivities unfolded, Roberto felt a deep pull in his heart, a desire to extend the blessings he had received to others. Remembering the surplus cargo entrusted to him, Roberto decided to donate a portion of it to local charities and community centers. His act of generosity was not just about giving food, but about sharing the spirit of compassion and solidarity. He reached out to those in need within his own community, ensuring that others, too, would benefit from the unexpected kindness that had come his way. Reflecting on the events that had transpired, Roberto realized how his initial misjudgment of the nun's actions had been completely overshadowed by the larger, unseen forces at work. Forces of fate, kindness, and divine intervention. He found himself echoing the nun's earlier sentiment, coming to believe that it was indeed a higher power that had brought them together on that fateful day. Little did Roberto know that the ripple effect of his actions would extend far beyond the nun and her family. The generosity he had shown resonated deeply within his own life, creating connections and opportunities that he could never have foreseen. Months later, as he shared his story with others in the community, Roberto emphasized the transformative power of generosity and faith. Each retelling of his tale only reaffirmed his belief that he had been a part of something far greater than himself, an intricate tapestry of human connection, compassion, and divine grace. "I hope you've enjoyed this story," Roberto concluded, his voice warm and sincere as he addressed his audience. Please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. The videos displayed on the screen will surely inspire you, just as they have inspired me. Until we meet again, may God bless you abundantly. With a smile, he ended his tale, leaving his listeners touched by the profound lessons of faith, generosity, and the unexpected ways in which lives can be changed.